Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And welcome to the Engaged Communities series. So, this is a panel in a series that's been going on for the better part of a year now. It's a joint initiative by the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SAAPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAAJCO. My name is Indira Khera, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm a writer and a journalist. I'm currently based in Wyoming. But previously, I was a freelance journalist and a reporter at WBEZ in Chicago, which is how I came to know about Sapri's work. I'm very thankful to be a small part of this year-long series, which brings conversations on civil rights and civic engagement directly to our communities. So, for those unfamiliar with today's organizing partners, I just want to take a second and talk a little bit about them. So, SAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was established in 2001. And through community-based research and strategic partnerships, they drive impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It's dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. And then our other partner is SAAJCO, which is a civil rights nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the US through impact litigation and community engagement. I'd also like to thank the Saba Foundation in Diaspora and Saba North America for their generous support of this series. The Engage Community series is designed to create space for South Asians and allies to access resources, knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with ideas that support justice and equity. Before we dive in, okay, so this is answering that question about the recording. This session will be recorded and will be available afterwards on SAPRI and SAAJCO's respective platforms. If you do have any questions over the course of our panel, please feel free to just drop them in the Q&A box. That's the best way to do them, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the panel and picking up questions. Today's panel is Protecting Democracy, Ensuring Fair Representation in an Age of Gerrymandering and Voter Suppression. So before we jump in, I'm going to introduce our three wonderful panelists. So starting with Leah Wong, who is the Voting Rights Director with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Prior to that, she was with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Her work centers on defending and advancing voting rights and racial justice through an integrated advocacy approach of litigation, community organizing, and policy advocacy. Our next panelist is Sarah Chen, who is the Voting Rights Senior Supervising Attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project. Sarah has led various voting rights challenges in Texas and most recently spearheaded the efforts to bring an amicus brief, or friend of the court brief, in Texas's statewide redistricting legislation. And she also serves as the board president of Asian Texans for Justice. And finally, our third panelist is Ami Gandhi, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and the Midwest Voting Rights Program with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She works to reduce barriers to voting and improve civic participation, especially in communities of color and low-income communities in the Midwest. Her experience includes litigating cases in Illinois and Indiana and partnering with communities to write and pass legislation. She previously was an executive director of SAPRI. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to our participants for being here. A little bit of framing for our conversation. You know, we're sort of at a moment in time when redistricting is really shaping political power across the country, and recent court decisions are raising questions about what fair representation looks like going forward. And at the same time, Asian Americans, South Asian American communities are growing, diversifying, and becoming more civically engaged. So to start, I really want to start with the fundamental questions. And Leah, I would love it if you could sort of walk us through some of these. So my first question for you is a very basic one. But what is redistricting? If someone had no idea, how would you explain that to them?
Thank you, Indira. So redistricting, like Indira said, is it shapes our political representation literally by drawing maps and districts that go from everything from the member of the US House of Reps to most of state legislators and also a lot of local legislators, so sometimes school boards, city councils, etc. These districts divide a general geography into various factions, but it hasn't always represented Asian Americans very well because redistricting is a very political process. It doesn't have to be, and many states tried to pass reforms to make it less political by having like independent commissions do it. But for the most part, it's always very politicized. It comes after the census typically. Again, it doesn't have to be as we're seeing right now with Texas, but historically it's come after the census because that's when we have updated numbers about how the population is represented. And that goes into how these maps are drawn. And the map drawing process can be quite contentious because it should be, again, not always, but it should be very public. And there's a lot of opportunity for people to show up, provide testimony, talk about why their communities should stay together, talk about whether their district or their legislator has represented them well, etc. And even though Asian Americans have been the fastest growing population in America, we've not always necessarily taken part in this process as much as we could have due to just historical suppression, maybe an understanding of this complicated process. So that's redistricting in a tiny nutshell.
Great, thank you. And can you talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act and like why it exists and how it also fits into these conversations about redistricting?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Voting Rights Act was passed during the height of the civil rights era, and some would say it's like the crown jewel of the voting rights era, or sorry, civil rights era. And it was passed because at the time, Black and Brown communities were ultimately facing all kinds of voter suppression tactics that didn't actually give them a chance to access their political opportunities in a practical sense. And so the Voting Rights Act had a lot of different sections to it. And unfortunately, in recent decades, we've seen different sections of it lose their um, power. One of the most important pieces of the Voting Rights Act was this part of it that essentially let the federal government vet when states who were historically racist, honestly, would pass new voting laws. At the time, the federal government was able to check whether, their new voting law was discriminatory or not. But 10 years ago, roughly now, 13 years ago, I guess, no, it doesn't matter. The Supreme Court got rid of that part of the Voting Rights Act. And so now the part that like people really care about is Section 2. And the reason I'm sharing that is because that's actually really, really sort of like there's a spotlight on it right now because the Supreme Court is currently drafting, I guess, an opinion that's going to come down any day now that will share whether or not they feel like the way Section 2 has been used can continue to be used that way. A lot of advocates like me, Ami, Sarah, we use Section 2 to bring cases when we see that, redistricting or voting practices are discriminatory, but the Supreme Court has already weakened Section 2 by adding lots of factors that you have to prove, et cetera. And now they might come down with a ruling any day now that says, using race to remedy racially discriminatory districts is not allowed. And if that sounds confusing, it's because it is. Um, it's the Voting Rights Act was created to literally remedy racial discrimination, and now the justices are basically signaling that they feel like we live in a post-racial society, and maybe the use of Section 2 and using race to fix discrimination is impermissible. So we'll see, but any time between now and June is when this decision could come down.
Okay. Okay. And well, like that sort of ties right into the next question that I had for you, which is like there have been these recent Supreme Court decisions. Like you said, there's a really big one that's impending. So what is changing in the legal landscape in terms of redistricting? I know you mentioned, this idea that race, like we might be, beyond that. But what including that is changing right now?
Yeah, so I think Section 2 is just one part of the Voting Rights Act. And, I do want to clarify that the Voting Rights Act still has a lot of other provisions that are really helpful, especially to Asian American communities, like the language access provisions. And those are not necessarily being challenged right now. And I can talk a little bit more about what those language provisions are. But in light of the recent Supreme Court decisions, I would say, in short, redistricting has gone even more politicized. As you all see in Texas, the president and his Department of Justice really encouraged slash pressured the state to essentially do a mid-cycle redistricting, and that has set off like a bunch of domino effects of now states redistricting. And believe it or not, the Supreme Court has essentially ruled that partisan gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering is, the way the maps were created. Partisan gerrymandering is okay, mostly because the justices at the time said that there was no good way to basically adjudicate whether something was partisan or not, so they just let it be. I think Sarah Nami might have opinions too about like how you would even frame it, but it's such a ridiculous part of our practice. But it's reality. And so then partisan gerrymandering is okay. Texas was allowed to do it. The courts didn't find, or the Supreme Court didn't think it was racially discriminatory. And so I think what we're going to see is a lot more partisan gerrymandering,
Mm.
whereas at the same time, um, as you may or may not expect, a lot of the times when uh, people tend to conflate race and partisanship when it comes to map drawing, and it's not always easy to see like which one is taking precedent. And so I think bad actors on both sides can argue like this map is racially discriminatory and XYZ, and you're just going to see a lot of convoluted legal arguments in the practice of voting rights, because the justices and the courts have honestly made it really hard for people to just use the law the way they were supposed to, which was to protect voters, give them utmost access to the ballot. So we'll see. But all that said, the Voting Rights Act also does things like provide limited proficient English speakers, translated ballots and services, and that's not under attack. I mean, there are currently ongoing lawsuits that will also try to weaken like who could bring those cases. But right now, advocates like ourselves, members of the public, can also challenge local jurisdictions who aren't providing the right services for folks who might want their ballot in a different language. And there is a threshold for it.
Mm.
The Voting Rights Act sets the threshold. But we're also seeing a lot of state voting rights acts getting passed in different states by that seek to do a number of things. A, enshrine the protections that the federal law provides us, but also B, go beyond that. So different state voting rights acts, sometimes they'll lower the threshold because they understand that their community is way more diverse than what the federal VRA really acknowledges. And so you'll see like states like New York, for example, lower the threshold so that a lot of Asian American communities who aren't always like a huge majority, can also get more language services to go and vote. And just like a fun example is in New York State or in New York City, you can also, so in New York City, Bengali voters were supposed to be covered under the Voting Rights Act for language access, but the city just failed to provide Bengali voters any language services or translated materials for years. So AALDEF sued, and then, we were able to like get those services in a settlement. And then this year, a couple of years later, you can really see that Bengali voters turned out in record numbers, made a huge difference in the Democratic primary that ended up being quite historical. And so it does show that when we allow people to have support actually casting their ballot, people will turn out. And I think that's really important for our community specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I just, before we get to our next set of questions, I see we have some people who are joining. So I just wanted to say again, if you have any questions over the course of the panel, please drop them in the Q&A box. That's where I'll be pulling from at the end of the panel to ask our panelists. the audience questions. So just a reminder. Um, Sarah, we were sort of just talking a little bit about Texas, and I would love to turn to you and ask you a couple questions about what is going on with redistricting in Texas. So in 2025, the president publicly urged Texas to deliver additional Republican seats in Congress. And the Texas legislature moved forward with a mid-decade redrawing of those congressional maps. So can you just, like provide us with some context? What changes did the legislature make last year, and how did state leaders justify those changes to the public?
Yeah, there are a few really abnormal things to highlight about this, right? It is hard to overstate how abnormal it was, how much it violated the norms and customs around redistricting for the president to ask for more congressional seats for his party in a mid-decade redistricting. We had just completed a trial over the 2021 map that was adopted according to, the usual schedule for redistricting after a US Census. 4 years later, because the federal courts moved pretty slowly, we had just wrapped up that trial because that map was itself, it violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and was racially discriminatory, including against Asian voters, who, as you mentioned at the beginning, are, the fastest growing um, racial group in the country. That is true in Texas as well. In Texas, we gained 2 congressional seats in 2021, based off of almost a population growth of almost 4 million people, 95% of which was driven by people of color, predominantly Latino, but Asian Americans are the fastest growing, and especially South Asians in the suburbs of the Dallas area, of the Houston area, in Brazoria County, Collin County, Denton County, make up a huge percentage of that growth. And so in the 2021 case, there were claims for Asian voters voting in coalition with other minority voters, that they deserved state legislative seats and congressional districts that really highlighted the growth of our Asian communities, and that we deserve the opportunity to elect the candidate of our choice as well. What partially precipitated some of these changes is actually a case that I litigated called Petaway versus Galveston County, which was against racially discriminatory redistricting against a Black and Latino coalition of voters that were voting for their candidate in Galveston County. And the Fifth Circuit in that case reversed its own precedent on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to say that in the Fifth Circuit, which covers Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, that we would not recognize coalition districts, that there would be no recognition under the Voting Rights Act that different minority groups or different racial groups could vote together for a single candidate of choice, and state a claim under the Voting Rights Act. And so that is really especially devastating for Asian voters and Asian communities because we generally do not make up the majority of a large enough geographic area to have districts drawn specifically for us. And so without coalition claims, the coalition claims that were asserted for Asian voters in Texas had to be dropped from the litigation over the 2021 map. And then, we get to 2025. This trial has just concluded, and we start seeing reports that Trump is asking Republican leaders to redistrict again, invest considerable resources and a lot of time and energy into somehow squeezing even more Republican seats out of a state that's already extremely, extremely gerrymandered, and already out of 38 seats, only congressional districts, I should say, 38 congressional districts. 30 were completely safe. Only 3 were competitive, and 5 were basically uncontested. And so it is already a place where there is not a lot of political competition because of the way that the votes of people of color, frankly, have been suppressed over the decades. The Trump DOJ followed up with a letter calling out 5 specific congressional districts that were drawn as coalition districts or otherwise drawn to respect the voices of people of color, and asking Texas to dismantle all 5 of those districts, mostly in Houston and the DFW area, which is, of course, where most of the voters of color live. And Governor Abbott picked up that call immediately, despite how obviously doing so would be using race alone to take away people's voting rights, which is basically a textbook definition of racial gerrymandering, which is unconstitutional and it violates equal protection. We cannot use race in this way, according to all of our precedents, but the Texas legislature decided to go full steam ahead with very little public transparency, opportunity for public input. But, organizations like ours, still tried to get people out to testify. We did see really amazing um, turnout by Asian voters as well, even knowing that there might not be a legal path ahead for some of our claims to still make it heard on the record that we deserved not to be discriminated against, that we deserve to have our voices heard as well. And so, I'm sorry, this is a very long answer, but all this to say
Oh,
is we ended up, in a special legislative session in a year that nobody thought that we'd be working on redistricting, with the legislature passing maps that did chop up our congressional districts in especially the Houston area and DFW. Houston suffered enormously considering that it has already lacked representation almost all year because Sylvester Turner, who represented Congressional District 18, passed away in March
mhm.
2025. The governor was responsible for calling a special election to fill his seat. He decided not to do so that there would be one fewer Democrat and one fewer person of color in our US Congress. And so Houston has not been represented by anybody in that
Wow.
congressional district all year until that special election was just called for November 2025. There's now a runoff election in January for the winner of that seat. And then in March, there will be a primary election under the new map that was just adopted,
Mhm.
that completely scrambles up the congressional districts of Houston so that voters of Houston have to go back to vote for a new representative, to replace the one that they had just voted for in the runoff. It's extremely confusing, and people are so frustrated because every change that is made is just worse and worse racial discrimination and dilutes the voices of color more and more. And so the hope that we see though is that not everything can be districted, right? Our statewide races, president, Senate, governor, cannot be redistricted in such a way to suppress people's votes, and everyone's vote does count equally. And then, as another, noted Asian American voting rights attorney, Michael Lee, has noted that because the gerrymandering has already been so extreme in Texas, they do run the risk of doing what's called a dummy mander, right? That it's a dumb move because it'll backfire on them, where moving people around like this ends up achieving unintended consequences from what they initially tried to accomplish by making other districts more competitive. So
Mhm. Yeah, and
that,
I go ahead, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, I just there's and then this didn't even touch on the litigation that ensued out of what the legislature
Yes.
did. So
Yes, well, that was actually gonna be my next question. Like, I understand that there was a district court that ruled the map unlawful, but then the Supreme Court intervened. So, can you sort of walk us through, yeah, exactly like you said, the legislation that, or the litigation that came after?
yeah. I just want to applaud the lawyers, plaintiffs, witnesses who moved so quickly to seek a preliminary injunction against this new map adopted in 2025. It was folks who were already exhausted from doing this full trial on the 2021 map that went back for a 10-day hearing in October, put on essentially a full mini trial that would normally take, a year to prepare for, within just months, to get this incredible evidence of intentional racial discrimination and racial gerrymandering in front of the three judges that were on the panel to review this case. And it's three judges in the district court for any sort of litigation over congressional districts. And so we knew we had to move quickly because of something called the Purcell Doctrine, the principle that courts should not change election rules kind of on the eve of an election or during voting periods, because that could confuse voters or create election administration problems. And like I said, we have midterm elections under the new map in March, with candidate filing in November and December. And so the advocates filed for this preliminary injunction in October, just so we could try to get this over with as soon as possible, to have the chance of reinstating the old map, which at least would be less confusing than changing everything to start with the 2025 map. Um, And that's where I think you mentioned the amicus brief. My organization, TCRP, filed an amicus brief on behalf of SAAJCO, Asian Texans for Justice, MGAGE, and other organizations representing Asian American and Middle Eastern voter serving organizations to emphasize the testimony and needs of our communities who are, continue to be cracked by this redistricting. And so this district court, majority of it, two judges out of the three-judge panel, did find that because of the way that the legislature dismantled the coalition districts named in the DOJ letter, that they clearly used race as the overriding, the predominant rationale for redrawing the map the way they did and achieved those clearly racial outcomes, and then found that the state might say that they were acting for partisan reasons, as Leah referred to, and they might say they're just trying to respond to this Fifth Circuit case, Pettaway versus Galveston, but that it was a 160-page opinion just going through all these different rationales, all the data, all the maps, the testimony of legislators, the testimony of people who spoke out in the limited hearings that were held, and found those explanations just didn't hold water, and the maps could basically speak for themselves in terms of their racial predominance. That was, we celebrated, right? It is not easy to get a voting rights or redistricting win in any court in Texas, and to have such a strong finding of racial gerrymandering was by a Trump-appointed judge was really worthy of celebrating. Unfortunately, the appeal that went directly to the Supreme Court, the majority of the Supreme Court did issue a 5-paragraph order within a couple weeks saying that they thought that Texas was likely to succeed on their claim that the district court was wrong and that the 2025 map should go into effect. And Justice Kagan has a dissent there that does a great job breaking down some seriously misguided reasoning and the consequences for voting rights and redistricting litigation. Happy to describe some of those consequences and issues a little bit more. And
Yeah.
if anyone, yeah, one of the issues with this reasoning is the application of the Purcell Doctrine, like I said, of what does it mean to intervene in an election when it's ongoing or on the eve of an election, right? Our primary election, it was 4 months away. The general election was 11 months away. And if we're going to consider any sort of change, including here where people had already been operating under the assumption of the status quo of the 2021 map, and it was just this shocking aberration to have this new 2025 map, to say that a court could not maintain the 2021 map because we were 11 months away from the general election is, as Justin Kagan pointed out, to say that we are all just in election season all the time. And how can we ever have successful voting rights litigation if courts are going to now be held to this standard that they should not intervene because an election is basically ongoing all the time? Very concerning. Another thing is the lack of deference to the district court. Like I said, 160 pages of detailed fact finding after a 10-day mini trial, essentially, with witnesses from both sides. And the district court carefully considered and rejected these different rationales. And normally, appeals courts are supposed to give deference to those kinds of fact findings by district courts. The fact that a majority of the Supreme Court was not able to or willing to do that for this district court panel is also really concerning about the ways in which they are willing to throw out that kind of fact finding, which is a real cornerstone of how our legal system is supposed to work, in terms of who the district court being responsible, because they can see the trustworthiness of the witness. They can make those kinds of determinations in a way that appellate judges, Supreme Court judges who are just reading the papers, don't have that same kind of context.
Yeah.
And then finally, the Supreme Court also dinged the plaintiffs and advocates for not introducing an alternative map that satisfied the same partisan goals with less racial impact. There was a Supreme Court case a couple years ago, Alexander versus South Carolina, NAACP, that announced this new standard for if there is no direct evidence of discrimination, that circumstantial evidence of discrimination requires the plaintiffs to also generate a map that accomplishes the same partisan goals with less racial impact as a way to kind of disentangle party and race in a country where, we have seen really polarized voting for, racial minorities tending to vote for Democrats and white voters tending to vote for Republicans, right? That is the kind of reality of racial voting patterns for the most part, and why it can be difficult to disentangle. This Supreme Court seems to have now tweaked or elevated this standard from this Alexander case to say it doesn't matter if there's direct evidence of discrimination here, where the legislature announced they are dismantling coalition districts because they are coalition districts for people of color. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it was such a short timeline. It doesn't matter. This is just a preliminary injunction stage, that there still needs to be this alternative map requirement, which does make redistricting litigation, which is already expensive and complicated, even more expensive and complicated because now every plaintiff needs to have the kind of expert on hand who can generate this kind of map to do this really
Yeah.
fine-tuned distinction. And yeah, those are so and I guess there's kind of atmospherically something else that Justice Kagan points out, which I completely agree with, that this 5-page order from the Supreme Court really makes it's not just that partisan gerrymandering is like a distasteful thing that sometimes politicians will engage in to maximize their own advantage, and is not, it's even if it's undemocratic, it's still permissible because the court doesn't have any good standards for adjudicating it. It almost more feels like the court is now supporting partisan gerrymandering in a sense, that it's not just then that it will be even more of a free-for-all for partisan gerrymandering in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Ami, I want to talk a little bit about what things look like in the Midwest. So, my first question for you, can you share a little bit with us about what's going on with redistricting in Illinois and in Indiana? Sort of walk us through what's going on there.
Sure. Thank you so much for the chance to be with you all in conversation. All of these organizations, SAAPRI, AALDEF, Texas Civil Rights Project, I learned from you all and had the chance to work together over the years. So really glad to continue to be in community with you. And these are some interesting stories for the states that I especially focus on in Chicago Lawyers Committee's Midwest Voting Rights Program, and particularly Illinois and Indiana is where I focus my practice, and I work in both states. And right now I'm in Indiana. And kind of an unbelievable story coming out of Indiana, if anyone saw it in the news. So advocates and state leaders were able to successfully push back on intense federal pressure to redistrict. This was at the very end of 2025. And there were threats of violence, doxing, swatting, just the list goes on. And it was such an intense atmosphere for state leaders and for advocates. And I'm really talking about many of our community partners. I'm not myself taking credit for this incredible turn of events, but recounting for you all and sharing for you all what it was like out here. And so this intense federal pressure was coming in, similar to what other speakers have mentioned, to try to change the partisan leaning of, in the case out here in Indiana, it was 1 or 2 congressional districts out of 9 that were at stake. And for the time being, the issue is resolved because of state leaders standing up against the federal government. And that was because of the people power, the pressure that all different kinds of people across the state, different kinds of constituents and voters put on the state leaders, saying it would be unacceptable to confuse voters essentially by changing up the lines so close before election time, and for a reason that was about partisan gain and national leaders trying to have their way, as opposed to the interests of the people here. And I know we'll talk more about advocacy strategies and what can make a difference here. But I did want to mention too, in Illinois, where it stands right now, is that the conversation has quieted about the possibility of mid-cycle redistricting. A couple months ago, or earlier in the fall and in the summer, some Democrats threatened to engage in mid-cycle redistricting for the Illinois congressional lines to get revenge on Republican states or actors that were trying to manipulate redistricting. And it's not necessarily clear what would be the political repercussions, to Sarah's point about dummy mandering, or unexpected consequences could happen, such as impact on communities of color and majority minority districts in Illinois if there is a attempted redoing of congressional redistricting to try to favor a party. In Indiana, it's super majority Republican. In Illinois, it's super majority Democrat. And so these are some of the dynamics at play with the mid-cycle redistricting currently not happening in either state. And let's see what continues to happen. And that doesn't mean that there aren't threats to voting rights in either state, because there are. And so we can talk more about that too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned, advocacy strategies, and so I would love to get a sense of in Indiana, what were some of the advocacy strategies that you observed? What was that work like from people, during this process?
It was incredible to see it unfold, especially after a last few years of seeing one blow after another in social justice, public interest, and voting rights work out here in Indiana. It's grim out here. I know we're not the only place where that is the case, so I didn't have high hopes for what might happen when the events were unfolding the last few months. But what ended up mattering was a message that real people in the state, huge numbers of constituents, did not want the mid-cycle redistricting, did not want the gerrymandering. I had the opportunity to volunteer with Common Cause Indiana at a Pride event in my town of Bloomington, Indiana, a few months ago. And Common Cause had petitions against the mid-cycle gerrymandering at this little booth at the Pride event. And I have never seen so many people sign a petition. And the colleague, Leah Ortes, amazing organizer at Common Cause Indiana, she would start explaining what the petition was, and she would just have half a word out of her mouth, and people would say, I want to sign that. I don't want any gerrymandering. I mean, just overnight, the people, the number of people and diversity of people who we've all had a crash course in it now of this type of political manipulation and threat to voting rights. And so that's what played out, not just at Pride Fest, but at many different kinds of events and gatherings. And there was a unifying message despite other divisions and policy differences. And I jotted down some notes from another player out here, ACLU of Indiana, and some of their credit goes to them, some of their reflections about what set Indiana apart for being able to have the outcome that it did in this fight against the federal pressure. And some of the unique positioning, what advocates think out here, is the coalition dynamic, strong coalition support, clear messaging about what should be part of the messaging, what is like maybe really tempting to get into, but maybe this is not the time or place to get into some of the other issues, like how I tend to about my other disgruntlements about Indiana government decisions. Credible and high profile messengers, and I would say numerous messengers. One person is not going to achieve this kind of organizing victory alone. Many different organizers in the field. It's a big state. It's a spread out state, big state, geographically spread out, I mean. And so people who know their community in different parts of the state, and infrastructure, of course, is important too. I observe in the Indiana democracy and voting rights work out here, there are different coalitions. Each one of them is pretty limited capacity. Not everyone is kind of unified around the same thing all the time. I have been sometimes seeing that as a weakness in my work in voting rights. The last few months, I've seen some of the strengths that come out of that. If people are willing to say, okay, this is an emergency situation, let's work together. Let's be okay with shared credit or different kinds of strategies. And so those were some of the beautiful things that I got to observe from partners out here. And hopefully it was a great reminder to us of the power that people can have in coming together, even though it's not typical at all. That's not how it has gone for other sorts of issues out here. So hopefully this can provide some inspiration and direction for all of us going forward.
Great, thank you. And then sort of just a quick question off of something that you just said. How do you see what happened in Indiana playing out potentially in other states in the Midwest or across the country? Like, do you think there could be sort of like a ripple effect from that action?
I hope so. And even if it's not about mid-cycle redistricting exactly, because I don't know about that. And I know that the reality for that specific issue is also changing as we get closer and closer to election dates, as other speakers have pointed out, with the legal limitations on what can be changed before elections. But I hope that the focus on what people want from their own community can be effective, if that can resonate, with when there are situations where state leaders, whether it's state legislators or a governor or an election official, can be moved by that, hey, no matter what pressure I have, the people here in my community, and especially if it's large numbers of them, are telling me that this is what they want. I hope that can be meaningful. And if it's okay with you, Indira, I can talk about Illinois real quick for a couple
Yeah.
minutes. So in Illinois, even though the conversation about mid-cycle redistricting has quieted down, and maybe the threat has quieted down for now, the impact of redistricting on communities of color in Illinois is far from being a resolved issue that's taken care of. There have been both historic examples of the power of communities of color in voting and representation in Illinois, in Chicago and Illinois. And there also can be roadblocks, for one community to have the opportunity to elect our candidate of choice, there can be attention or wariness about what might be the downstream negative effect on another community. So that is the story of some of the complexity around voting power and redistricting in Chicago's Chinatown, that now has stronger representation than it did in decades past. But it took a multiracial organizing and political strategy to get there because of various communities of color living among each other, voting power impacting each other's communities. And in a different community in Illinois that I wanted to mention, because my point is, even in a super majority Democratic state, and I know we are nonpartisan organizations here, but even in a place that has different political leadership, there can still be issues with threats to voters because of redistricting and manipulation. And so in the 2021 redistricting cycle in the East St. Louis area, so the part of the St. Louis metro area that's across the river and on the Illinois side, southwestern Illinois, there was a dilution of Black voting power there. And Chicago Lawyers Committee with co-counsel represented NAACP and a multiracial coalition trying to challenge that, because it was a historic Black-led seat in Southern Illinois where, for the first time in decades, because of the dilution of Black votes, it's now since the 2021 redistricting and vote dilution, now represented by a white male Republican representative, and who won't even meet with NAACP. I mean, forget about his party, but he won't talk to the people there. And so we did bring a Voting Rights Act challenge, and it was a close case. But in the end, we lost because the court said it was too close and said, we don't know if the bad predictions that the civic organizations are fearful that will happen, we don't know if they'll actually happen. Unfortunately, they did. And the elections changed because of that vote dilution. So the last thing I'll say is that we are trying to do something about it, and community organizations are trying to do something about these issues that play out in Illinois as well. And Leah talked earlier about the real opportunity in state voting rights acts. And so we're really privileged as Chicago Lawyers Committee to be leading the effort with many different partners locally and nationally to try to bring about a stronger Illinois Voting Rights Act, to bring in protections where the federal protections are failing our communities, and also to have some innovations that haven't been done before around language access, like AALDEF has expertise in, and other types of protections too. So the the struggle continues, the efforts continue to try to improve voting rights, even though we're in the bleak environment that we're in.
Thank you. So I want to turn to a few questions just sort of for all of you to answer and pull from some of our questions that we've started getting in the Q&A box. So someone asked, if you could share some examples of grassroots community action that you've seen successfully stop or slow down harmful voting policies or maps. And I also sort of wanted to tie this to a question that I had hoped to ask you all, which is, like, what does this moment tell us about where redistricting reform is headed? What strategies seem the most effective at this moment in time? And anyone can jump in.
I can start from Texas because I think I probably gave the bleakest description of the situation in Texas. That being said, we still have wins thanks to people showing up and pressuring their legislatures, testifying, sending comments. For example, in our legislative session in 2025, we thought it was almost certain that the state would pass a documentary proof of citizenship requirement for registering to vote, which would mean that when registering to vote, you would have to show a birth certificate or passport that shows that you are the person registering to vote, even though we have other kinds of mechanisms in place to verify that people who are registering and voting are already citizens. And there is very, very, very little non-citizen voting occurring. That is just a not negligible occurrence and problem for something that would have caused potentially like 10% of Texans to basically be disenfranchised completely because they don't have access to a birth certificate or a passport. And this would have, had really negative consequences for married women, for example, who've changed their names, for the elderly or young people, students who are moving around, right, who don't have these documents on hand to register to vote. And so, yeah, we thought it was almost in the bag for the legislators that wanted to pass this requirement. It is something that President Trump is advocating for at the national level too, in various illegal ways. And we got a coalition together that turned out and defeated this effort to pass this harmful legislation. Similarly, in 2021, when Texas was passing this omnibus voter suppression bill that we are also still litigating because the courts do move very slowly, that it was advocacy by people showing up, protesting, speaking at the legislature that caused some really, really harmful provisions to be taken out, like banning early voting on Sundays, which would have, reduced the ability to do kind of souls to the polls type drives and other and restrictions on voter assistance, which can be really important, especially for API communities as well. So that kind of turnout really matters. And then I'll also say on the local level, we do a lot of local redistricting work at cities, counties, school boards. And I have seen in many counties where it's people who are just really invested in how their tax dollars are spent, showing up and testifying against changes, against unfair redistricting, and succeeding and making sure that maps are drawn more fairly. It's the folks that live closest to you that you will have the most impact on at the grassroots, and it makes a huge difference into how like flood disaster relief money is spent, or different infrastructure laws that might protect marginalized people like LGBTQ people or people seeking abortions. Those kinds of policies can all be influenced at the local level, in addition to a lot of the other kind of local governance that you're thinking of. And turning out to speak out against redistricting at that level is going to be extremely important, especially if the Supreme Court changes how Section 2 can be used, as Leah referenced earlier, with this Louisiana v. Kelly case that is expected to be decided anytime now. We might see a lot of moves to redistrict to reduce minority voting power in the future, but especially at the local level, showing up and noting your opposition the way that folks in Indiana did, it really, I mean, the Indiana example is truly so inspiring and shows that there is always reason to hope when you speak out.
I wanted to add on top of what Sarah said that I mean, if you all think that there's like an onslaught of things happening, it's because there is. Like Sarah's entire chaos with Texas was like only recently, but now all of us as advocates are indeed, like she said, prepping for what might happen if the Voting Rights Act is further gutted. And so I think right now, one of the most like important things people can do on a grassroots level is attend their local official meetings. That might be your Board of Elections meeting, it might be the city commissioner, city council. Every single jurisdiction has, and state does, and county basically do elections differently. And sometimes, like, depending on which election it is, if it's like a midterm or like a local election versus a federal election, the local body that runs that election is also different. The system is not designed for transparency and for accessibility, but that's why it's all the more important for everyday folks to show up. It's in those meetings that, states and local officials who are ready to suppress voters will pass like some innocuous regulation that looks totally normal, but actually is going to make voting or someone's ballot counting so much harder later. We saw this in Georgia. We see it in like states in the South all the time. And then also even in blue states, it's where decisions about like, yeah, like just resources or services that the local officials are expected to provide, decisions are made about that. And if our communities, especially Asian American communities, like everyone that falls under our huge monolith, if we don't show up, people just don't think that they need to work as hard to like do something that they are required to do potentially, and they can blame it on just like being able to handle it or not, right? And so it might not look like outright suppression, but it definitely isn't helping voters access their vote. So truly right now, it's just being engaged with those local officials. They make decisions like where poll sites are going to be, and things like that, that really affect your like community on an annual level. I think otherwise, Sarah already listed a whole bunch of stuff, but Ami's example really reminds me like we're going to see state voting rights acts get passed, hopefully like across multiple, or not, sorry, get introduced across multiple states if the Federal Voting Rights Act is weakened. And so, we're part of a steering committee right now where we know that there's going to be a launch of a model bill this month. And so, kind of like how folks on the sort of like anti-voter bucket of people do things, they'll just duplicate and scale like the same resolutions or same laws. Like I think we kind of have to start taking those strategies into consideration. And we're doing that with state voting rights acts. So, once that gets introduced in your state, like you have to call your state legislators, like make it mean something to them to pass. And that's one way that you'll be able to like do something too.
Great. Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to add? Grassroots strategies and also just like what people can be doing right now.
One of the things I've seen SAAPRI do well as Coalition for Better Chinese American Community and others, and Illinois work I'm privileged to do, is really think in a wise way about coalition opportunities. When we have some small capacity organizations, I count myself as one of those, it's helpful to figure out how can we collaborate with others to achieve things. I know it's not the most straightforward thing. None of us want endless meetings or coalition configurations or anything like that, but there really is a lot that we can achieve if we split up work and get a chance to work with people from different communities. The results can be tremendous.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we are just about at time, but before I wrap up, to our panelists, is there anything else that any of you wanted to mention? Any sort of closing sentiments that you want to leave folks with?
Um, if you don't mind, I'd love to just remind folks that our vote really does matter. And it sounds trite, but people would not be trying so hard to take this right away and to curtail it if they didn't know it matters. And I think that our sometimes our communities take our votes much less seriously than the people who oppose us do. And so take your vote as seriously, especially in this moment. And also, I think remembering we started with the Voting Rights Act and the conditions that the civil rights movement was facing um, are were horrific, right? And were violent, where it felt like an uphill battle. I think probably in most ways more so than the conditions we face now. And I think it's just a good reminder that if our forebears could pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, we can also demand for that national and state level and local legislation to constrain, the excesses that we're seeing now and the suppression that we're seeing now. And so just a note of comparison and hope.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add that even though everything else looks so awful right now, sometimes it can feel hard to talk about voting rights because it feels technical or it feels like, what's an election going to do when we're seeing XYZ out there on the streets. But um, as you all can kind of tell from this panel, voter suppression is like a decades long strategy and it's been slowly building up to this moment. So everything that you're seeing in your daily life or on the news, it happened because opposition or anti-voter folks knew how to build power in a way that really enshrined their ability to run this country, both at the federal and local level. So we have to play that game. And even if it's hard to like sometimes feel like we're drinking out a fire hose of like terrible things happening, one thing you can do is tell your friends how important it is to like care about these somewhat sounding like boring things, but they lead to building power, like building redistricting maps. It helps us like actually have some sort of say in this country in a way that like will protect us from whatever's happening now, hopefully.
I'll just add real quick, I see Sarah's background, 866 Our Vote. There are companion lines for other languages. Really encourage everyone to use that as a resource. There are some helpful resources out there, even with conditions changing. And so encourage people to use those.
Well, thank you three so much for joining us for tonight's conversation. This was wonderful. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. I hope that this was an insightful and engaging conversation. Before we wrap up, I just have a couple quick notes. So, SAAPRI is currently conducting a live survey to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. Your voice is important, and we would really appreciate it if you could take a couple minutes to complete the survey. That link will be available in the chat and also on SAPRI's website. We're also going to be compiling notes and key takeaways from each panel and sharing that as a resource with attendees. So please stay tuned for that in the coming weeks. And finally, our next panel is going to be on February 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Pacific. And that one is going to be about Voting Rights 101, bridging the gaps in community participation. And you can register using that standard Eventbrite link that will be dropped in the chat. Well, thank you all so much for being here and for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Of course. Okay. I will see you all soon. Bye.